Hello again, and welcome back to Petroleum Economists' LNG to Power Forum for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. We're staying in the MENA region now, having had a look in the last panel to look at the importers in the region. And what's interesting about Middle East and North Africa is that the countries face an unusual combination of opportunities and challenges when it comes to meeting their energy demand in general and electricity demand in particular. While the region is very hydrocarbon rich as a whole, the resource wealth is very unevenly distributed. So some countries like Qatar have vast hydrocarbon resources, while others have had to resort to imports, especially of natural gas. We've seen this happen in the UAE, especially in Dubai, Kuwait, Jordan, Egypt for a while, although it's now ceased importing because it's found so much gas in the Med. And of course, Bahrain, I think, is the newest member of this club. Another interesting aspect to MENA is that oil is still widely used for electricity generation, despite its high cost. And so even oil-rich exporters face pressure to substitute oil where possible with something else, and gas is one of the options. The other thing about the region that's unusual is that because of the climate, there's a big need for desalination plants to produce potable water. So a lot of the power stations in the region have desalination plants attached to them. And of course, we will see lots of solar power happening in the Middle East. It has the right climate for it. But even in the Middle East, the sun doesn't shine at nighttime. So there will still be a need for backup generation, synchronous generation to back up intermittent asynchronous renewables. So lots to talk about in this panel. And your moderator will be Fauziah Marzuki, who is with BloombergNEF. Fauziah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Today, I've got Niamh, Carole, and Ryan with us for this MENA importers session. As Alex said, it's such an interesting region. He mentioned the LNG importers. The region has been almost resilient to COVID-19, contrary to what we see in APAC and in other parts of the world. LNG flowing into the region has been relatively steady compared with over the last few years. The interesting one, a sign of what's interesting in the region is Bahrain, as Alex said, a new entrant to the market with a very new FSRU that actually happens to be floating off the coast of Spain right now after loading a cargo in Cove Point, Maryland. It just shows that how dynamic the industry can be and this market can be. So let's try to unpack some of those dynamics during this panel session. I'd like to turn over now to our panelists and ask you to just give us, what do you think is the most interesting aspect of this region with regards to gas consumption? And I'm going to turn it to the token gentleman on the panel first, Ryan, please.
Thanks very much, Fal. So good morning and good afternoon to you wherever you sit in the world today. And it's actually good to be described as the token gentleman. So congrats to Petroleum Economists for really working on the diversity of this event, and you've achieved a lot. So thoroughly looking forward to this. As we start to think of it, Fals, yourself and Alex have already mentioned quite a few key issues in the area. And for me, the world would do really well to actually come and zone in on the Middle East region, which is already, ahead of the game very much in terms of gas utilization for both power and other uses as well. So yeah, you could look at it and say, yeah, granted that energy demand in the Middle East is perhaps less material than other regions. So a couple of weeks ago on this same forum, we spoke about Asia Pac, which has got a huge, 70% of the world's LNG demand. But, I think here there's still a huge focus on growth, especially for gas, fuel substitution, and as a viable solution for the intermittency of renewables, the problems that we face, as Alex mentioned as well. So I think the Middle East, to me, is to some extent, and the Middle East MENA region is really interesting, and also at the same time forging their own path with renewables. But I think, as I was giving this event some thought this morning and some very brief opening comments, is that the most interesting feature for me is how will this gas renewables dynamic actually play out in the next decade? So there's two questions on my mind, really. Firstly, will the energy industry and energy transition advocates who we're all becoming part of blindly just tar gas with the same like dirty black brush as with all other fossil fuels and coal as well, and in doing so force investors to solely and like blinkily just pursue renewables despite its economic, competitive or intermittency shortfalls? Or will a more balanced approach to hopefully take place, an arguably sensible approach take place to ensure that gas features in the energy mix? So I think my final thought is, I've said it before and I'll say it again. For me, it's a race to decarbonisation, not just a race to renewables. And natural gas, I think, with an increasing focus on decarbonised gas, must be a part of the energy mix for me over the next 20 to 30 years.
Great. Maybe Carole, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Well, if I look at the Middle East solely, and you can say perhaps something similar for the rest of the MENA region, but one thing which I found particularly interesting is that we're talking about the region that sits on the largest gas reserves in the world, proven gas reserves, and yet it is only the third largest producer behind North America and CIS. And if you take Qatar out of the equation, out of the picture, then the whole region becomes a net importer. And it's not because of lack of gas resources. There's plenty of gas there, but there is limited exploitation. And most importantly, therefore, in my opinion, there is lack of cooperation between different countries, because when you have countries like the Kuwait or elsewhere importing LNG all the way from Norway or from the US, while they're sitting next door to the largest gas fields in the world, is really a consequence and a symptom and indicator of poor cooperation across the region. And the big question when we're talking about the future trends is whether this is going to change or not.
Great, thank you. Maybe Niamh, yourself?
Thank you, Fauziah. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be joining you all and my esteemed panelists here. So for me, really, the most interesting feature for gas in the region is, I think, picking up really nicely on what Carole said, which was the potential for gas to have almost or maybe even as influential a role in sort of domestic and political dynamics in the region, across the region, internally within countries, across, bilaterally. So for the next 60 years, like oil has, for the last 60 years, OPEC was formed in September 1960. It has played a role in regional politics ever since, and 60 years and 8 days later, the East Med Gas Forum Charter was signed just on the 22nd of September. And I think this year's been a fascinating insight into how certain countries are using the East Med as part of their sort of international relations, foreign policy, maneuvers. And I know that we're going to touch on that later. So yeah, it's really very exciting.
Great. I'd like to stay with you, Niamh. You talked about the different factors. So let's maybe, could you share with us your thoughts? What are the, shall we call them, the building blocks as to why a country in this region would be importing gas? What are the cost benefits associated with LNG? Is there some kind of trade-off between efficiency, affordability? Your thoughts, Niamh?
So, I think the key one is affordability. If we look at the countries in the region, more broadly that import, so all types of gas, what I find so interesting about them is that it's where that sort of traditional clear-cut division of net energy importers and exporters, or sort of hydrocarbon fueled economies versus, others that are more diversified, starts to break down. So I kind of, if we take all of the countries together, I group them into kind of two categories. The first is sort of Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan, and Iraq. And then the second is the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Israel. And just taking, I know that Iraq and Bahrain sort of seem like outliers, and I know we're going to talk about them in a little bit, but just taking that first group, Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan, and Iraq, Morocco and Tunisia, I think in particular of that group, LNG is a really, really great opportunity for them. But they are countries that, need to make political trade-offs whenever there's economic decisions to be made. Just because of the structure of their economies, they have less fiscal room than, the Gulf states, the Emirates, Kuwait in particular. So ultimately, if they can take advantage of cheaper gas, that's going to be a blessing. And I know that the previous session on exporters mentioned the possibility of a supply bubble. So really that group of countries could really benefit from lower prices, like just relative to other fuels. I think geography as well, the East Med is, on their, it's part of their coastline. So for Morocco and Tunisia, there's sort of like longer term benefits are there. But, when we bring in other factors, economics, politics, things do start to look a bit different. If we just take a single measure of debt to GDP, Morocco's is 66%, Tunisia's is about 77, 78%. It's very manageable, but over time, the costs of servicing that debt are going to increase. And like I said, these are countries that do have just less room for maneuver overall. So for example, with Morocco, we have seen them delay their planned LNG terminal to 2028 due to costs. So that's sort of a really good example highlighting how it's going to be more difficult for those countries who don't have much fiscal room to be able to spend large amounts on that infrastructure. But what's been fascinating about this year is because the pandemic, the collapse in energy prices, and then also how governments have reacted or not to these. And to your point about how the region has managed to be relatively unscathed by the pandemic so far, which is frankly miraculous. You do have some of those countries moving into more precarious positions. So Iraq, that I kind of put in group one, is a good example. Countries with high wage bills, more diversified, but fundamentally less dynamic economies. 2020 has really kind of crystallized these issues within them. And so it's going to make decision-making on gas, it's a net positive without a doubt, but it's going to be quite difficult for those countries sort of over the next couple of years.
Absolutely, those are all really fantastic points. Ryan, perhaps, do you have any other additional comments with regards to recent trends in the LNG industry and maybe how that might support these importers in these countries?
Yeah, I fully agree, Niamh, with all the comments that you've made there. I think, very pertinent comments on some of the factors there. But I think you mentioned it briefly, but I think one of the facts that's overlooked, most often is just simply that there's an absolutely huge and growing hunger for energy demand in the region, which is predominantly driven by increased electrification needs, as well as industrial and, of course, transportation requirements as well, all of which are needed to fuel really growing economies with, frankly, rising young populations who want more energy, want to move about, want the mobility that we've become accustomed to in the Western world. And as you mentioned, Niamh, a great stat there. I think you said 60 years and 8 days post the formation of OPEC in relation to the East Med Gas Forum. I think we'll talk about that, but it's a region where I believe is a great example of some of these trends. Raising it back up to the EMEA level for the moment, whilst renewables, as I said in my opening comments and as we heard this morning, are of course continuing on their development curves, I think flexible, decarbonised gas really can provide, so to talk to your point about trends, Fauziah, I think that flexible, decarbonised gas, it really can provide a reliable and certainly, environmentally and climate change competitive, let's say, generation source compared to heavy fuel oil, diesel and coal-fired generation, which we see in the region. So think about it more broadly, lower costs, better performance of small-scale technology in particular is really opening up these new markets globally, but for gas utilisation, but also in the Eastern Med. And specifically, I'm referring here to the likes of LNG and gas use in marine applications, for example, in bunkering, but also in transportation more generally. And just zoning into, the Middle East, for example, if you look at Kuwait and the UAE, they've emerged and they'll continue to be huge drivers of gas demand going forward. But taking a look a bit further, you've got the likes of Bahrain, Jordan, Cyprus, Lebanon, Libya, but then also potentially Iraq, as I'm sure that we'll not be able to avoid a discussion on a bit later.
Oh, great. Maybe let's shift a little bit. Let's go to GCC. Carole, you were talking about cooperation possibilities. What more cooperation can we see in GCC? I mean, there's only one current interregional pipeline. Yeah, maybe talk to us about the balancing the supply and deficit in the region.
You know, it's interesting that you said what more can be done. Well, a lot more, because you're starting from almost nothing, from only one pipeline that connects Qatari gas to the UAE and Oman. But that's it. And again, I go back to the opening remarks that it's quite ironic that you have so much gas in the region and yet only one pipeline. Now, many pipelines have been discussed in the past between different countries, yet they just remained in like words and plans, but nothing has been executed. And I go back to the very important issue of political fragmentation, because it's particularly relevant when you talk about East Med as well, which is even more politically fragmented than what you have in the Middle East and more like towards the GCC countries. And it's down to religious, tribal rivalries, you name it. But there is a deep mistrust or distrust between neighboring countries. So, you know, usually we tend to think of the Middle East, politically speaking, as divided between two clans, the Saudi-led clan and then the Iranian-led clan. But it's actually, when you look closer at the history of these countries, you see almost every country with its neighbor had wars or issues on disputed territories. So this must have created some kind of lack of trust. And this has translated to issues of security of supply, that they'd rather have access, tap into the global markets of LNG, even if it comes at a premium compared to cooperating with the neighbor, because that would expose them to a bigger choice, diversify their options, and makes them less vulnerable to a moody neighbor who might suddenly close the tap. That said, interestingly, what happened with Qatar tells us otherwise. You know, when the GCC countries, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and even outside the GCC, like Egypt, they cut ties, diplomatic ties with Qatar. Many were wondering whether Qatar was going to cut supplies through the Dolphin project pipeline, but this did not happen. And you hear different perspective. On the one hand, the Qatari perspective that they didn't want to be assimilated to the Russian practice, and they wanted to show that even under these kind of conditions, they would honor their terms, and therefore that would send some kind of assurance to other important customers, particularly in Asia. But there is also the other side of the story, where the UAE would simply cause disruptions to LNG coming from Qatar to the rest of the world. So this is where you think that, okay, maybe there could be some hope there, that even though you don't trust your neighbor, there could be some benefit in cooperating, because you're not going to be as vulnerable as you might think, as the Qatari experience has highlighted. But there's definitely plenty of potential. Again, economically speaking, it makes perfect sense. But as we all know, with gas, it's more about politics than necessarily about economics, and geopolitics and security of supply play a very important role.
Absolutely. And, you know, sometimes I wonder, you know, Israel gets pretty much all of its LNG from Trinidad, you know, all the way from the Caribbean. Perhaps with normalizations of relations, will we see Abu Dhabi LNG go there? We'll see. Who knows? Very, very dynamic region. But, you know, we've touched on sort of North Africa, and, you know, we keep mentioning East Med, and I want to make sure we can try to touch on all of the main markets that people are interested in. I'd like to go first to Saudi Arabia. So we know that their efforts to shift away from burning oil, pivot to gas, we've been hearing a lot of news that, okay, so they're investing in an LNG plant, they set up an LNG trading desk in Singapore, they might import, they've got their shale. Maybe we start with Ryan. What does all this mean? Is it going to happen? What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Faz. Yeah, it's, you know, when you've got so much going on, I think to try and delayer that in a short period of time is quite a tough challenge. But for me, I think, you know, when we think about this and that question about Saudi, I think we should all remember and probably not forget that actually they were one of the first Middle Eastern states to really start to appreciate the economic value of capturing and utilizing associated gas from the substantial oil production that's produced by the kingdom. So I think that is a first step, you know, realizing that is coming a long way to actually forging a path for the future. And in many ways, you know, if you look at Saudi, they took a very strategic approach there to gas processing, gathering, transportation. And in my view, you know, to that extent, they're a very strong example for others in the region and also others globally to learn from. You know, in recent years, I think, as you mentioned, you know, we've seen very clear indications from Saudi rulers that there will be a much greater emphasis on natural gas, both domestically and also externally, you know, looking at other investments elsewhere. So it'll be interesting to see what we do envisage in the next decade. But whilst maybe some of that near-term focus is really, you know, is that near-term focus, as I said, has to be on a lower carbon fuel source for power generation and as a way to boost oil exports, whether that's EOR, etc. Longer term, I think there could be some scope, potentially a lot of scope for LNG exports or indeed pipeline exports, as Carole mentioned, you know, to neighbouring countries. Why not? I think finally, just briefly touching upon the point of shale, you know, the vast shale opportunity in the kingdom as well as elsewhere globally. I think here I always have to caution with regard to unconventionals, because we do a lot of work on unconventionals around the world. And there's a fine balance between the pure economics of domestic gas production compared to the availability of low-cost imports. And this is especially true if the country like Saudi could potentially embark on a major international investment further down or up, the gas value chain in gas-prone areas.
Sure. Maybe Carole, you know, because Ryan touched on sort of capturing the associated gas, you know, obviously Saudi Arabia with its larger OPEC role. What do you think, briefly, what Saudi Arabia's role may potentially be in this gas arena for the future?
Saudi Arabia, just like its neighbors, has a substantial potential, and they actually have very ambitious goal to become a net exporter at some point. But really, when you look at the execution, not much has happened in that respect to push them into that direction. Now, of course, Saudi Arabia is the leader, the de facto leader of OPEC, and a member with the biggest production in terms of oil, but it has a feature that is equally shared by other neighboring countries, that most of its gas is associated gas. And as such, the production of gas or whatever plans that you have for natural gas will depend on oil production and whatever you decide to do within OPEC. So if you go to curtail oil production because of OPEC strategy, as we have today, then your domestic gas production is going to be curtailed as well. So as long as you have this kind of connection between the two, then I'm not quite sure whether Saudi Arabia would be able to go too far with its gas ambitions. That said, there could be an opportunity for private investment in that respect, because Saudi Aramco is a world leader in terms of oil exploration and development and processing, you name it. But I'm not quite sure whether we can say the same of the expertise in terms of gas, especially if you're talking about sour gas, which is quite common across the region, and it's more expensive to develop. And therefore, it may pay off to have more private investment coming into the country. So that could be also one step. I would take it a little bit beyond natural gas, but link it more to the economic diversification of the kingdom. So it's not just about diversifying the energy mix, getting more gas in power generation so you can free more oil for exports, but also by bringing in private investment, you can support the bigger strategy for the kingdom for economic diversification and the 2030, the Vision 2030.
That's great. As Saudi is one of those markets in terms of gas that we're still trying to wrap our heads around. So this is fantastic. Let's move now. Let's hop around again. Let's go to Iraq now. Niamh, could you tell us what the recent white paper might actually mean for the country? You know, it's got so much gas. It does have the gas potential. It's just a matter of harnessing it, capturing it. What can we see potentially in terms of gas consumption patterns in Iraq?
Of course. Well, I mean, when it comes to consumption, it's ever increasing, both gas and gas to power in itself, and that's kind of really one of the many reasons why Iraq is in the bind that it's in, politically, both domestically and also with its allies. with the US. And it's funny, the Iraq gas story is one that we keep coming back to, and it's very much 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But I feel like over the longer term, we are getting somewhere. So I mean, the white paper's vision is it's pretty idealistic, to be honest, even potentially overly optimistic, because it's fundamentally quite difficult to see it materializing. So if we, sort of divide it up into 2 parts, so there's the kind of bureaucratic and the structural reform that needs to be done, reducing the size and the cost of the public sector in the sort of first instance, the ministries, but then also, dealing with the issues in the sector itself. So gas to power distribution, in particular, power distribution needs to be dealt with. They need enormous investment, well beyond the capability of the state. For example, one of the reforms that they suggest is, removing electricity subsidies for all but the poorest 20% of Iraqis. That's politically going to be incredibly unpopular, very difficult to get through Parliament. It could even be potentially be impossible. There need to be, and as the white paper lays out, sort of these structural and economic regulatory reforms to make Iraq, the vibrant destination for investment that will be needed from the private sector in order to get the gas to power sector or where it needs to be. But fundamentally, before these sort of structural changes happen, if they can happen, there needs to be a period of sort of established and political and economic stability, and that, it's been a very, very difficult year for Iraq this year with the pandemic, with the fall in oil prices, and given where Iraq sits right now politically, 2021 looks like it might be even more challenging. So the white paper is a great vision, but there is potential for it to remain merely just a vision, which would be, a little bit disappointing, but we'll see how it goes.
You kept talking about sort of ambitions and visions, and it got me thinking about not just gas, but the decarbonisation ambitions of many of these countries in the region. So let's shift a little bit to decarbonisation ambitions and goals in the region and how gas may play a role in all of that. Decarbonisation was mentioned sort of in the earlier sessions in Europe, with Europe very much leading the charge on that. But maybe let's go to Ryan. Could you give us your thoughts? How specifically can the Middle East importers play a role in the global energy transition? What can they do?
Yeah, I think happy to give some thoughts on that. And I think interestingly, what both Carole and Niamh just said on, Saudi and Iraq, of course, there are huge opportunities, but that often comes with huge challenges as well. And I think one of those challenges is around bringing in private investment. So how they're going to encourage that, as I think Carole touched upon briefly. And I think that overall, coming back to your question, which you've just raised in the wider EMEA region, I think that the players here have got a huge role to play in how the energy mix is transformed in the region or continues to be transformed in the region, as well as setting examples, say, globally. So I think they'll need to focus on both on diversity of direct consumption fuel sources as well as power generation sources. Secondly, for me, I think countries will need to look at energy self-sufficiency to whatever degree that may be possible. And we've already spoken about that and the conflicts between self-sufficiency versus cost and, the political angles on that. And thirdly, I think perhaps presenting the biggest challenge to the industry in the decade ahead is this increasing focus on environmental and climate change performance. And I think this is where the EMEA's market players have got a huge opportunity to play going forward. I haven't seen, a tremendous amount. So, for example, if we look at carbon neutral LNG cargoes, we've been doing some calculations here where the range of full offsets could be anywhere between 2 million and say $10 million per cargo. So let me just contrast that. If you look at that in terms of a cargo at today's or recent values of $20 million, that's a staggering amount to offset a cargo when you're talking of paying $2 to $10 million on a full life cycle basis. Or if you look at $40 million for the price of, say, 2018. So huge opportunity, but I haven't seen too much, if I'm honest, coming out of the region, but I do see little whispers. Whereas if you look to Asia Pac, we see a lot of activity on carbon neutral cargoes going forward there. But I think, there's a huge, for me, the region has got a huge role to play, because ultimately it has to find a way of decarbonising its own domestic use, as well as decarbonising use of the production of whether it's petchems or refined products or products to go elsewhere, because ultimately that's the market for where they're going to ship it out to in the future.
This is all great, and it gets me thinking on sort of specific countries, and the UAE actually comes to mind with sort of imports into Dubai, but with the Jebel Ali recent gas find, they've got also very ambitious solar development plans in the region. Maybe can we get Niamh's your thoughts, and maybe Carole later, on what how is the UAE going to juggle this? I mean, I said they've got very ambitious solar, but they still now have a lot of gas. How's their transition going to play out?
I think the best way to see it is to compare the way that, say, Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan have handled it, which is sort of fundamentally rewriting their environmental policies to sort of actively decarbonize their energy supply where they can, with somewhere like the UAE, where although incredibly ambitious solar plans, really quite exciting, if they can follow through, it would be fantastic. I am personally a little bit skeptical that they're going to be able to follow through fully in the way that they've envisaged, but the progress they'll make is fantastic. But fundamentally, I think it's sort of including renewables in the energy mix, in addition, rather than to actively decarbonize. I mean, the UAE's sort of gas self-sufficiency, aspirations are fundamentally based on two assumptions. The first is increased demand over the next sort of 20 years, domestically from homes, retail. And then the second is increase industrial consumption, because the UAE wants to use gas as not just the feedstock, but the literal and metaphorical fuel to become an industrial powerhouse, in the Middle East, North Africa region, which as a whole has really struggled to build an industrial base effectively, in the way that the UAE has been implementing over the last several years and is really, really delivering on. Jebel Ali is going to help that, going to help fuel that. If you look at the federal energy strategy for 2050 that was laid out a while ago and that came before Jebel Ali, gas is still going to be 38% of total supply, energy supply. So it's less about decarbonisation than bringing some renewables in to just create more energy in the economy as a whole. So gas is going to be that fuel for industrial sort of diversification in a way that's sort of unique in the region. So it's going to be a fascinating case study.
Absolutely. Carole, do you have anything to add maybe on the UAE, after which I'd kind of like you to give us your thoughts on some of the East Med developments?
Yeah, on the UAE very quickly, I mean, I would put the UAE and other GCC countries in the same buckets with respect to their quite ambitious plans for decarbonization, for the energy transition. I'm not quite sure how much progress can be achieved in the very limited time frame. Of course, looking at 2050 seemed to be much more realistic than looking at 2021, when originally, I think it was 2017, when the UAE said that they wanted to achieve 24% of their energy mix from clean sources of energy, from almost nothing. Then, and still very modest despite the nuclear power contribution. So really starting from very low base, but they have, of course, the technical problem that they have to address. It's not just that about the intermittency or variability, to be more accurate, of renewable energy, and the sun does not shine in the night, which are two problems shared globally. In the Middle East, you have two additional problems. Having lived there, especially in the UAE, I can assure you that these are quite serious problems. A, you have the heat, and second, you have the sand, and both can negatively affect the performance and the efficiency of solar panels. So we want to see some technological developments on that front. But putting that aside, I'm thinking that the Middle East in general, the oil and gas rich countries, they have a strong case for decarbonization and pursuing energy transition, at least domestically, because that would free up more oil and gas resources from power generation and makes them, perhaps they would contribute to either the ambitions of the country to become net exporters or self-sufficient in gas consumption, or even net exporter of gas in the future. So they create this kind of virtuous cycle that would benefit the countries. But again, I am always suspicious of very ambitious plans which go beyond 10 years, because if you look at our track record everywhere, they tend to be quite disappointing.
Fair enough, fair enough. Let's now turn for the last few minutes, turn to the East Med. So again, one of those very dynamic regions. Let's talk about if I'm a supplier, which country, or so let's take an LNG supplier, which country should I be focusing my attention on? Carole, if you could give your thoughts, and then I'll turn over to Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, if I look currently at the current status, I would say your biggest market, I mean, of course, Egypt is the largest gas market in that region, but the one which has been growing quite rapidly would be Turkey, which I would include in that part of the world. And then you have Israel, but they have sufficient gas to meet their domestic needs. So I'm not quite sure how much Israel would mean to exporters. Then you have the two very poor gas poor countries, not in terms of resources, but in terms of consumption, because they nearly consume almost nothing in terms of gas, and that is Cyprus and Lebanon. But really for Lebanon at least, I mean, maybe Cyprus is moving faster on that front. Lebanon, we're still very far away from achieving what the government wanted to do over the last few years because of this triple whammy of economic crisis, no discoveries, domestic discoveries, no, government collapsing, and the coronavirus crisis. So all these are putting serious pressure on local consumers and the capacity to fund or pay for these kind of projects. And I know that maybe a few years ago, the government announced its plans to have 3 floating LNG in the country, one in the north, one in Beirut, and then one in the south. Now, I have to smile because if you look at other countries with this kind of facilities, they tend to be market-wise, size-wise, 10 times bigger than Lebanon, and they would opt for perhaps maximum 1 FLNG to import LNG. So this tells me, again, the decision in Lebanon is not about the size of the domestic market, which currently doesn't exist, and even under most ambitious scenarios, there is limited capacity. But as again, such decisions are not driven by economic sense, by commercial realities, but by politics, because they want to satisfy the various political factions in the country, and that's why they went for the north, Beirut, and south.
I was going to say, do you have any insights on Lebanon importing and any of those 3 FSRUs going to materialize? But thanks for addressing that. Ryan, do you have any sort of last thoughts with regards to sort of East Med and perhaps the whole decarbonisation theme in the region?
Yeah, I think, what Carole, obviously some of Niamh's comments earlier about the region overall have highlighted is this huge role that politics has to play. And for me, if you look at the East Med, it's a pretty positive spot to end on. Actually, you've seen some of the greatest exploration and development activity in recent times in the region. So it's a real hot spot for us in terms of gas. It's been an honor, for those of you who know, GaffneyCline served the World Bank and worked with the 7 members of the East Med Gas Forum to actually set up that forum earlier this year. And I was in Cairo in January presenting to all of the ministers. So that was a real privilege and an honor. If you think about that, though, I'd say it's not about competing. They are all competing. It's about the need for collaboration, because the aim, really reflecting on the aim of this group of people, what they were there to set up to do is to maximize the economic value of gas in the region in the short, the medium, and the longer term. So, they had realistic time horizons as to what they can achieve in both. And if you look at the original 7 member countries, you've got Cyprus, Egypt, Greece, Italy, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. And when we were at the meetings, we had participation from the USA for various reasons. We also had France as an observer, all of whom have expressed interest to join the forum. But stepping back, if you look at, take a reality check, as Carole maybe said, if you take the approximately 30 TCF gas in place find of Zohr a couple of years back now, it's hard to ignore it, and it caused a lot of excitement, and rightly so. But when we've been looking at Egypt and the gas demand over the past 5 years quite intensively, I think not many people appreciate that it will take a Zohr-like discovery every 2 to 3 years just to keep up with domestic demand growth driven largely by power generation. And I think more broadly, having analysed the Eastern Med region over the past decade or so, when we look at it going out into the future, out to 2030, we can see the gas deficits of around about, as a whole, of around 5 BCF per day. And then if you look 2030 to 2040, this grows to some 12 BCF per day as a region. So putting that into context, US LNG today in the short term would be around about in the 5 to 10 BCF per day range, depending on full operations of facilities and potential turndowns due to economics. So the gas deficit that I mentioned there, in which Carole touched upon, has to be met somehow, but it can't only potentially be met by domestic development of abundant and potentially low cost and potentially low carbon, and more importantly, gas in the region. But ultimately, the final point is that it has to be met by increased regional collaboration, not necessarily competition, regarding developments, infrastructure collaboration, increased utilization of pipelines, LNG imports and LNG export facilities. And we need to think about this in a rational, economic way, as well as trying to navigate some of the politics at play.
Absolutely. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that looks like all we have time for. It was a great panel. We talked about sort of the potential, the cooperation, the ambitions, perhaps, like over ambitions, how the region can play in decarbonization, and all the sort of signposts that we need to look out for even greater excitement in this region. Panelists, thank you so much, Niamh, Carole, and Ryan. And for everybody listening in, this is the end of the session. We now have a lunch break for 1 hour, and the next session will begin at 14:10 CET time. Thank you so much.